Hi, this is Kim Hammer with your devotion taken from 2 Samuel chapter 1. This is the account of where David receives the news that Saul has died on the battlefield. As he receives the news, obviously he is going to go into a state of grief and mourning, but as the story unfolds, it calls into question the messenger that delivers to David the news of Saul's death. In fact, as we see the story goes on, he will be held accountable because of his actions, which causes us to wonder, why was he there in the first place? And you need to get your story straight if you're going to tell a story at all. We find that in verse 4, the first thing that would indicate as to whether or not this person's intentions were honorable is the fact that he only mentions that Saul and Jonathan had died, when in reality the other two sons of Saul had died as well, but they're not mentioned in the account that he gives to David. The second thing is, in verse 6, he says, I just happened to be there. If you're in the middle of a war-torn situation where two nations are fighting it out unto death, you just don't happen to be there. You're there either intentionally or you're there because you were sent there, but you just don't happen to stumble up on a situation. My personal opinion, he was out looking to see if he could plunder the bodies, because as you read on, you find that he actually had Saul's crown that he had with him, as well as some other personal possessions that he had. When you get down to verse 7, he makes a quote of something that Saul is supposed to have said to him. Saul is supposed to have said, what can I do? At this point, Saul was supposed to have been wounded, and he said to this individual, what can I do? In reality, Saul would not have said that, because if you go back and read the account, he wanted his armor bearer to go ahead and thrust the spear through him and kill him, because the archers had already wounded him. Whenever it is that this individual that's telling David this approached him, he would have seen that Saul was wounded, and he would have offered to do the same thing, or Saul would have asked him to do the same thing if indeed that was the case. I believe he came up on Saul and Saul was already dead, and that this is something that he just made up. This gentleman was also a Amalekite. Amalekites were the ones who had come into the city that David and his family resided in, and while David was gone to fight with the king of the Philistines, you remember that they are the ones that came in and took off David's family and all the other family members of all the other soldiers and plundered the city and burned it. When David found out that he was an Amalekite, no doubt there was suspicion in David's mind. Personally, I think this individual probably just stumbled up on David, and in reality, he had to make up the story once he got there. As it goes on, we find that after David and his men have a period of mourning when they realize that David and Jonathan and his two brothers were dead, David did the natural thing, and that was he reacted out of sorrow and out of grief, which within itself I think is a statement of David, because Saul had hunted him like an animal and he considered David his enemy. Yet David responded as one who lost a loved one, a family member, because when you read it, he actually considered Jonathan to be like his brother. This is not the natural reaction of somebody whose enemy has been killed. And then finally after that, David turns to the Amalekite and he says, now tell me again what you did. And he said, well, I thrust the spear through him because that's what he said he wanted to do. David in turn had that individual killed, because David knew that if that truly was the case, that this guy would have done like the armor bearer did and said, I cannot touch thy anointed one. And when David realized that the man had been lying to him, he held him accountable for his actions. We need to be sure that if we're going to tell a story or recount something, that we tell it accurately, or else we too will be held accountable as we should.